Great. I want to bring in Myung-koo Kang here to talk a little bit about the view from the South. Obviously, you're in the middle of election season after a very turbulent time in South Korean politics. And I understand that the front runner also has some concerns about U.S. military deployment of THAAD. How is the people feeling right now, and given the historical context that we've just been talking about as well?
Basically, we need to understand, I can observe the huge perception gap between the United States and South Korea. Many South Korean people have felt that their voice, genuine voice, has been marginalized in the course of determining the policy in dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis at the moment. For instance, the President Trump made it quite clear that Carson, strike work group would be dispatched to the Korean Peninsula, but it was not kept. Right. So the South Korean people feel that it's a kind of cheated kind of disbelief. So we can see that if any kind of war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, the negative consequences would be horrible to the South Korean people. But in terms of dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis at the moment, surgical attack or preemptive attack has been quite seriously considered by the U.S. government, but it has not been quite close consultation with the Korean government. Of course, the Korean political situation right now in a political vacuum situation, but even under such kind of situations, President Trump did not talk with the acting president of the South Korean government.
Can I just follow up one question with you? What's your feeling on the fast deployment of the THAAD missile system? Do you think the Americans want to get it operational before a new government, potentially hostile, comes in? And also, just answer this one other question. Obviously, Japan is part of the alliance. What is the feeling between Seoul and Tokyo right now? Because you guys are not on the same page about this crisis as well, right?
Right. But, okay, the current, most strongest presidential candidate, Moon Jae-in, he made it quite clear the newly established government should to negotiate about the THAAD deployment with the U.S. government. Because China's government made it quite clear if South Korean government deploy the THAAD missile defense, if that's the case, China's government will launch more retaliatory measures. So at the moment, the Chinese government made quite clear that it's going to prevent travel to South Korea, even targeting the specific company which provided THAAD site to the Lotte company. But the thing is that in terms of understanding this North Korean nuclear crisis, we can observe another huge perception gap between Japan and South Korea as well. When quite recently, the Japanese government launched the emergency drills, targeting young people and then children, preparing for potential missile attacks from the north. But we should understand that in the South Korean context, South Korean people had to deal with such kind of situation for the past 7 decades.
Interesting. And let's bring in Tong Zhao here. Now, Chinese diplomacy obviously in full swing at the moment. We've had, for example, Wang Yi, the foreign minister at the NPC, lay out this dual-track approach, which was the idea of an end or a freezing of the exercises we've been talking about between the ROK and the US in return for a potential freeze of testing ballistic missiles and nuclear testing by the North, and then some sort of pathway going forward. Let's just listen to him in Germany in the last 24 hours, because this is a message being repeated.
The most pressing issue right now is to take up negotiations again. All conflict parties have to work on that. I highly value it that Foreign Minister Gabriel supported our initiative. That's surely only a first step. Our ultimate goal is very clear, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. This peninsula must see a sustainable and long-term security mechanism and freedom.
Tong Zhao, Wang Yi was obviously referring to the German foreign minister there. Where is China's diplomacy right now, considering also the Trump administration is saying they want the Chinese to put more economic leverage on the DPRK? Is there a way to get to what Wang Yi is proposing?
I think China has already trying, very hard to cooperate with the U.S. to impose additional economic pressure onto North Korea. The problem is there's only so much that China can do more in that direction. After several rounds of UN Security Council resolutions, we have almost sanctioned anything available about North Korea. There is not much more that we can do. And the recent rhetoric from the U.S. government about the military option really further intensifies the tensions in the region. So from the Chinese perspective, a military strike would be too risky for everyone in the region. And we cannot really hope that a slightly increased economic pressure will force North Korea to denuclearize. So the only solution possible going forward is really to freeze the further development of North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities before we can hope for a more radical agreement on denuclearization. And therefore, I think China is now making a lot of efforts, hoping that both of the two major stakeholders, North Korea and the United States, can be more open to the idea of a near-term agreement that can diffuse the tension and have both parties at the negotiating table.
Brian, the U.S. has talked about additional sanctions, secondary sanctions, pretty almost like what happened with Iran before the nuclear agreement, financial, but also an oil embargo. Now, anyone knows their histories about oil embargo in Asia. This is a very risky thing, especially for countries that require massive oil imports. Do you see them doing that, and what do you think the effects are going to be?
Well, that would depend on their ability to influence China, really, on the question of oil. Of course, you're referring to how World War II started, I think, with the oil boycott of Japan. The United States is ratcheting up economic pressure on DPRK and insisting that China do the same. I think they're trying to see if there's a way to separate the DPRK from China, in which case, if they feel the DPRK is more isolated, that would, I think, allow the Trump administration to countenance the idea of even more aggressive actions. Let's remember, this is largely a manufactured crisis. Nothing has changed in terms of what the DPRK is doing, say, from what it was doing a year ago, including its offers to suspend its missile tests or nuclear weapons tests in exchange for canceling the military exercises that simulate the destruction of their country. Nothing has really changed. The Trump administration, for its own purposes, is ratcheting up those tensions, creating an atmosphere of crisis. Now, what's the purpose of that? Is it to impact the South Korean election so that the Myung-koo party, the liberal party, doesn't get elected? Is it in order to mute Trump's domestic critics, because they're all lauding him right now? The critics, including the mainstream media here, which were denouncing Trump, once he started bombing Syria or threatening war against North Korea, they're all applauding. They're saying, hey, this is what it means to act presidential. In other words, the Trump administration has its own motives. But is there a solution? North Korea will instantly reciprocate if there was a genuine offer for a peace treaty or even the diminution of tensions based on perhaps seeing the framework of freezing or putting a cap on its nuclear program in exchange for a normalization of relations. Most wars have a beginning. They all have a beginning. They all have an end, except this war never has an end. Why not?
I'm glad you said this, because what you basically framed is this a departure of the Trump administration from the Obama administration, who had this policy of strategic patience, as it was called. And we were told that the strategic patience era is over. We had Vice President Pence go over to Asia, looking tough on the DMZ, all that sort of stuff. But the Trump administration briefed senators today, and they issued this statement from Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and also Defense Secretary James Mattis and the National Intelligence. And I want to read you part of it. The president's approach aims to pressure North Korea into dismantling its nuclear, ballistic, missile, and proliferation programs by tightening economic sanctions and pursuing diplomatic measures with our allies and regional partners. That sounds like strategic patience, doesn't it?
Well, that would be strategic patience if, in fact, that's the real policy. I think what the Trump administration right now is saying, look, we don't want to start a war. We don't want to initiate a war. We're not that reckless. We want the North Koreans to abandon their nuclear program. But let's face facts. North Korea will not give up its nuclear deterrent for all the reasons we've talked about, Iraq, Libya, all of their lessons from history. The question is, will the Trump administration genuinely want a solution, which means not denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but freezing the Korean nuclear program in exchange for a normalization of relations?
Thanks for your answer. Peter, I want to just put this in historical context. The Trump administration say it's a national security interest if the North Koreans, DPRK, develop an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that could hit the mainland of the US. Given you're a student of the history of the Cold War, if the DPRK did develop that strategy, do you think the US would have to react or trying to do that militarily before that happens? And is it a big threat?
The US would react, and it does pose a potential threat. They already have the capability. You have to realize we've got 28,500 US troops in South Korea. They already have that artillery on the border there.
Right. So they can already hit the US troops, yes.
They can hit you not only 28,500, but there's also 200,000 American citizens in South Korea. The Seoul area is a very dense area, population-wise, and it's got 20 million people in that area. So even before we have to worry about the ICBMs being able to hit mainland the United States, they can wreak incredible amounts of damage and destruction in that area. So the threat is already there. It's a time, as we're all saying, that sober people have got to sit down and act like adults. The problem is Donald Trump does not know how to act like an adult. And he draws red lines. And he says that if the Chinese can't solve this problem, then we're going to do it ourselves.
Okay. Thank you. I want to bring in Myung-koo Kang for a final word here. You know, where do you think this is going in terms of the Korean Peninsula? Do you think the tensions can be resolved, or do you think we're in for more weeks and months of brinkmanship?
It's a very tough question. It depends, but let me highlight. We need to learn from historical references. For instance, when the first North Korean nuclear crisis happened in 1993, it lasted about 18 months. In the end, United States and then North Korea agreed, reached an agreed framework. And then that framework worked quite successfully for 8 years. And then going back to the 2002, President Bush announced North Korea as one of those axis of evil countries. But about 1.5 years later, the United States agreed to launch 6-party talks. So in terms of understanding the effectiveness of military sanction or military options in dealing with the North Korean crisis, we need to also think about other diplomatic and economic and secondary sanctions, all possible options.
Thank you very much. Georgia is better than war, I heard once. Thank you so much, everyone. Myung-koo Kang out of Miami. Thank you very much, Peter Kuznick as well, and Tong Zhao in Beijing. Brian Becker here too in the studio. That's all we have time for. Thanks for joining us on this edition of The Heat.